Hello. Hello again. This is actually take two. I didn't like the first one. This is Paul. We're talking about A Course in Miracles, and we're going to talk about some of the laws of heaven and how they're different to the laws of the earth, and why the two things are so opposite. I got some quotes here that I printed out from the course, and these quotes are very cryptic. They're difficult to make sense of because they speak of a blurring of boundaries between things in such ways that normal ego thinking doesn't really make sense. So these all sound kind of nonsense. And the reason for that is the way that most people think, the way I think most of the time, is kind of in terms of space, where over here there's a sectioned off thing, it's a separate object, and it doesn't share anything with any of these other objects. And over here there's another separated off object that doesn't share anything with this object, and they're separate. And so you say something about this that's true about this, it's separate from this other thing, so you say, well, that means that other thing, it's not true of that other thing. Like you could say, this car over here is a red car, that car over there is a blue car, and they're different. And so the ego's way of compartmentalizing the world puts things into nice little tidy boxes, and they're nicely contained, and each object that you label, you could say, is sort of like a self-contained thing that's separate from other objects. And then we have this way of reasoning with logic based on these distinctions and these forms of separation based on appearances. So like you could say, if a banana is yellow, and here I'm holding a fruit, and this fruit is, I don't know, some purple grapes, because the grapes are not yellow like the banana, they cannot be bananas. That seems like makes sense, it seems logical, seems to be reasonable. That's kind of how the ego thinks. They'll sort of say, if this matches this criteria, it's this. Otherwise, if it doesn't, it must be that. And the ego has this exclusive way of thinking and reasoning logically, where it uses exclusion to section things off and compare them and contrast them. If 2 plus 2 is 4, and 1 times 4 is 4, then the two answers are the same. Or let's see, if I have male body parts and that person over there doesn't have the male body parts, that person is not male. That's this basic ego kind of thinking, like you put it in a box, you put this other thing in a box, you keep them separate, you compare them, and if there's differences, the differences are emphasized, and then you come to this logical conclusion based on appearances and based on these nice, neat little boxes that don't share anything with each other. They're separate from each other, and that separation allows you to have this kind of reasoning, this kind of thinking. And so, because this world is made by the ego, and all the objects in the world obey laws of separation, that kind of thinking maps onto this world very well, and you use it every day, And it seems that you can think about objects in this way because they're obeying these laws of exclusion and separation, and that seems natural. And it seems like that's the only way to think about anything. But there's another way of thinking, because this way of thinking is completely alien to how God thinks and how God's creations think. It is completely in defiance and ignorant of the laws of God and His mind and how His reality functions. So, I'm going to read you a few quotes. Pretty short. Some of them might seem like they sort of make sense, but some of them just sound ridiculous. So, to the ego's way of thinking, some of them sound, what the hell does that mean? So, the recognition of the part as whole and of the whole in every part is perfectly natural, for it is the way that God thinks, and what is natural to Him is natural to you. So he's saying that a part or a distinct thing is a whole, and yet the whole that seems bigger than the part is in every part, and the same whole that's in this part is also fully wholly within this part. And now we're starting to get mind-bending, because like, how can you have the whole be over here and the whole is over here? And that doesn't compute in ego thinking. Here's another one. For in your part lies all of it, without which no part is complete, nor is the whole completed without your part. So in your part lies all of it, without which no part is complete. So now you've got all of the whole of everything within you, and other people have all the whole of everything in them. How is that possible in terms of if they've got the whole, there's nothing left for me? If they have just bought all of the bananas from the store and they've wiped out the whole supply of bananas, there's no bananas left for me. How can they have the whole of the bananas while I also have the whole of the bananas? And that is upheld by the physical laws, which are the ego laws, that try to prove that this is truth, that only one of the two of us can have all of the bananas. We cannot both have everything. We can't both have the whole. But the Course is saying that in every part lies all of it. Every part has all the bananas. So this makes no sense to this kind of thinking. Accepting his completion, he would extend it by joining with another, whole as himself. So now it's saying, I'm whole. I am a whole, not an a-hole. Fuck. I'm not an a-hole, but I'm a whole. And yet somebody else is a whole. How can there be two wholes? Because if I'm whole, there's nothing lacking for me. If that person's whole, there's nothing lacking from them. How can we both be whole, the whole of everything? How can I be the whole of everything while my brother over there is the whole of everything? To the ego's thinking, that's total nonsense. It has no way to comprehend how it makes sense. There can be no disinherited parts of the sonship, for God is whole, and all of his extensions are like him. So not only does God have many extensions, many sons, many children, all of them are like him, and he is a whole. So now he's the whole, a child is the whole, another child is the whole. Everybody's a whole, and yet there are parts. There can be no disinherited parts of the sonship. The sonship has parts to it, and each one of those parts is whole in and of itself. How is that possible in ego thinking? It's not possible. So then the ego thinks that doesn't make any sense, that's nonsense, and then it will try to come up with its interpretation of what that must mean through its filtering and its way of thinking and putting things in boxes, and will distort the fuck out of that statement and come up with a conclusion that is completely false and total nonsense, which it will believe makes perfect sense. And I'll say, this is the sense that I see in this. And it'll be nonsense. It'll be made up bullshit. Everything the ego perceives is a separate whole without the relationships that imply sharing. I'll come back to that because that's to do with the separate self and how that separate self is different to your soul, and how the lack of sharing in the world is a big issue. But basically it's saying that everything your ego perceives, everything in this world, is a separate whole. So like a separate object or a separate particle or a separate cloud or a separate body, whatever, without any relationships that imply sharing. So to the ego, if you were to say that I am the whole and my brother is also a whole, the only way that's possible is if we share the whole. The ego says, no, you can't share the whole. There's no sharing allowed here. And so it can't accept that the whole is in both of you and can only see each of you as partial and limited. The whole of God's Son lies in all of us, but not in any of us alone. God would not have us be alone because he does not will to be alone. So there's things to this where the ego is going to launch onto this and screw the fuck out of it and say, how can it be that the whole of God's Son, or the whole power of God's Son, lies in all of us, which means that there is in all of us, there's many of us, and yet the whole of the power of God's Son is in all of us. Doesn't make any ego sense, but not any of us have all of it to the exclusion of other people having all of it. This drives the ego up the wall, and then the nature of heaven is so different to the nature of the earth and the ego thought system. The earth is part of the ego thought system. Heaven as a place is God's thought system. Knowledge, which is God, creates a thought system. Perception, which is ego, creates a thought system, and both of those are very, very different systems. And when you try to use the ego system to look at God's system, which is very different, it's blind. It cannot see neutrally or objectively what God's system is actually like, because the ego system is fixed and stuck in this one way of looking and compartmentalizing things and comparing them, separating, excluding, isolating, that it can't look at the absence of isolation or the absence of separation or the absence of exclusion and recognize it or even get its head around it. It defies and breaks the ego's way of looking. So when the ego tries to look at it, it's gonna attempt to take pieces of it and put it in a nice little box, and take another piece and put it in another box, and come to little conclusions about it. But those conclusions are going to be so wrong. Though every aspect is the whole, you cannot know this until you see that every aspect is the same, perceived in the same light, and therefore one. So an aspect is another way that Jesus talks about parts of the sonship and individual sons and souls, parts of God. An aspect is the whole. And just that alone is nonsense to the ego. If you've got a part of something, it's not the whole. If it's an aspect, it's not the whole. So then it's when it says every aspect is the whole. So your ego has to be like, what the fuck does that mean? How is that possible? It does not seem to make sense. It must not be the truth. And then you'll come to some other conclusion about what that must mean, other than see it as it is. Noisy airplane today. I live right next to a small airport, so there's a every altar to God is part of your soul, because the light that He created is one with Him. Would you cut a brother off from the light that is yours? So every altar to God, which is your soul, in fact it says every altar to God is part of your soul, and an altar to God is a soul, meaning that every other soul is a part of your soul. How is that possible? And so people might look at that and say, well, that means that I'm everybody. There's only one person here. That's incorrect. That is the ego thinking in its way of reasoning, using separation and exclusion, and saying either I'm everything or I'm nothing. So it can't understand that statement. So it will come up with a false conclusion and say, well, there's only one soul then. There's only one son. Because how can it be that my soul contains all the other ones? Am I God or what? What's going on here? And here's one that's even more cryptic. One brother is all brothers. Every mind contains all minds. For every mind is one, such is the truth. Every part is a container of the whole. Okay, so if you listen to this with your ego, one brother is all brothers, what does that mean? Me, as a brother, is literally equal to all of the other brothers. Therefore, if they're me and I am them, there's only one self. That'll be the conclusion that the ego's thinking will come up with. It's not correct. That is not the truth. One brother is all brothers. Not only does this mean that there are many brothers, otherwise why even bother saying it? You might as well just say there's only one son. There's no brothers. But that's not the case. There are brothers. God has created children. There's the family of God is a literal statement in the Course. And each of the children that God's created is a brother to each other. And so now I'm one of those brothers. You're one of those brothers. Your family members are brothers. and yet it's saying one brother is all brothers. That does not erase the fact that there are many. There still are many brothers, many distinct individuals, many parts, many aspects, but they're still one. And so now your mind is like bending and trying to stretch and trying to imagine, how can this be that there's sort of a oneness at the same time as that there is a manyness. And a lot of people freak the hell out whenever you mention many or separate, and they think that means ego, because that's what the ego thinks. And then you try to figure out, what does that mean? How is it possible that one brother is all brothers? It doesn't make any sense. And the conclusions that people come to as to what that means are arrived at using ego logic based on separation and exclusion, which comes to false conclusions. Every mind contains all minds, for every mind is one. Does not mean there is only one mind. For every mind is one seems to imply that there is only one mind, but the rest of the sentence says every mind contains all minds, and therefore there are many minds. How is it that there are many minds and one mind at the same time? And to the ego, this is where the alarm bells go off, and people start thinking, you're talking about duality, or you're trying to mix things together and have oneness and duality at the same time, and God is only non-duality, and all this crap, and errors in logical reasoning. There's just one other quote I have here. We have also emphasized that man, insofar as the term relates to soul, has not only been fully created, but has also been created perfect. There is no emptiness in him. And God has created many souls. The kingdom of God contains all the sons, all the children that God created and their creations. And a lot of people are trying to figure out, or think that they have figured out, the nature of heaven and whether or not there's one son or many sons, and whether or not the fact that there's many sons means duality and separation and ego. There's a lot of confusion around this, because the ego is being used to try to understand something that is not ego. And people don't realize how different heaven is in its nature to this compartmentalized, separated out, exclusively isolated kind of world and way of thinking, that they don't even see why they're making a logical error, or why they're coming to a conclusion that isn't correct. Now, God does not think in terms of space and time, does not think in terms of separate objects, does not think in terms of this thing over here is different to this thing over here, does not think in terms of this thing in this box here is different and separate and excluded from this thing in this box over here. That's not how God thinks. That's not what his reality is like. That's not what his creation is like. The recognition of the part as whole, and of the whole in every part, is perfectly natural for it is the way that God thinks, and what is natural to him is natural to you. And some people have realized that this basically means God is holographic. In a hologram, you have a whole and you have parts of the whole, and each part contains the whole. So like in those little holographic images on your credit card, every little speck of the image contains a picture of the whole image, or several vantage points or views or angles looking at an object at that point. It contains multiple pieces of information in one place, and so when you move around you can see other sides of an object even though it's a flat image, because it's holographic, and the whole, or more information than just what would seem to be in one place, is stored in one place. The entire universe is right here on the tip of my finger. And this is how God creates, it's how God thinks, and it's natural. So God, who is omnipresent, is everywhere. God is the whole. God is also fully present in every part of that whole, which doesn't just mean God is mostly over here and partly over there. It means every part of God is over here and every part of God is over there. And to the ego, that would mean God has to have a copy. You got to have more than one God if that's the case. So that's how the ego can't understand it. You can't get your head around how is it possible that all of God and the entirety of God's awareness and being is fully, without limit and compromise, completely present right here and completely present over here and up here and over here. Because God defies space-time, and space-time is an illusion. It doesn't exist. So what that means is all of God is in every part of God, and all of God is in every other part, and the only way that's possible is by this one key principle that is true of heaven but is not true of the earth, because the ego has opposed it, and it is the idea of sharing. So over here is all of God, over there is all of God. It doesn't mean there are two gods or that God is separate. It means there's one God, and these two parts are sharing all of the whole. So like in this world, the ego's laws are the total opposite of that. Here's an object. Actually, I won't use that. I'll use this. My water bottle. If I have this and I give it to you, I lose it. If I hand it over to you and you have it, I don't have it. This is the ego's law. This is sacrifice. It is loss. It is limitation. Everything in this world obeys these rules. These are the ego's laws. They're the laws that make space and time be what it is. They're the laws that make the earth, the planet, the physicality of objects in space, allows them to seem to make sense and to seem to exist. Is this law that what is in one place is not in another place. There is no sharing. I cannot have the whole of the liquid in this bottle if you're going to have some of it. We can't both have all of the liquid. And so the only thing you do then is you're going to have to sacrifice. You're going to try to compromise. By compromising, we're both going to be at a loss. There's going to be a lack, and we're going to suffer. Neither of us gets the whole liquid. If I give this liquid away, I lose it. Even if I'm being generous, if I give you all the entire liquid, I get none. That's the ego's law of exclusivity and separation and sacrifice and loss and lack, which runs this universe. And it's totally unlike the nature of heaven. Heaven is not like this at all. If I was in heaven, and if it was possible, just for analogy, to have this in heaven, if I was to give this to you and wanted you to have the whole thing, I would still have the whole thing too. Both of us would get the whole. And if you remember, this is because it's all to do with ideas being shared. When you share an idea or a thought with someone else, it increases, it extends, there becomes more of it. This is how Jesus multiplied food in the miracle. If I give away what I have, I still have it. To have all, give all. So in heaven, God's law functions totally different to this world. As God creates, as he extends and shares and adds to existence and increases, his giving in order to create, in order to give something of himself to what he creates, does not diminish him in any way. He doesn't lose anything. He doesn't become smaller. He doesn't lack. It's not a sacrifice. Giving and receiving are the same. As you give, you keep. As you, in order to have all, you give all to all. So if I give everything that I have to you, it proves that I must have had it. And in God's reality, I don't lose it either. We both get the whole of it. There is sharing. This is a fundamental mechanic of heaven's reality, that there is no decrease, there is no loss, there is no sacrifice, there's no lack. Anytime that anybody gives anything, it just increases more, and they both share everything. So going back to some of those quotes now, it means that if I'm all brothers or all minds are my mind, it doesn't mean there aren't separate minds. How holy are our minds? It just means that we get to share in a way that is beyond the ego's version of sharing. In the ego world, sharing means loss and lack. Like, you want to share your pizza with me? Well, you can have half of it and I'll have half of it. But I really wanted to have a whole pizza. So if I have the whole pizza, you're going to starve. So neither of us can have a whole pizza. To share is to sacrifice and to lose. And it seems charitable, but it's a bad compromise and a poor substitute for what sharing really means. Sharing really means that we literally both get the whole of something. So the recognition of the part as whole and the whole in every part, which is a holographic idea, is perfectly natural. It's the way that God thinks. And so as God thinks, he's putting the whole of himself into a part. That part contains the whole of him. He's putting the whole of himself into another part. That part now contains the whole of him. And there isn't some part of that whole that the other one doesn't have. There isn't competition. There is no fighting and saying, you've got some of the stuff that I wanted. They both get everything, and the way they both get everything is because they're both wired into this one whole. So then you can say there's one mind that many minds share. There are many parts who share everything with the whole. There's many suns who altogether share one mind and are one sun, yet they are many suns. And egos are not very happy with this as a logical argument because it sounds wrong. It sounds like some kind of separation idea or some kind of weird ego mishmash logical conclusion, or it doesn't make sense or whatever, but this is what God's reality is like. God is omnipresent, and his omnipresence expresses in a holographic way whereby everything that he creates, every individual thing gets all of him. Your soul has not only been fully created, it's been created perfect, and there is no emptiness in it, in you. So all of God's fullness has been given to you, specifically you, and it's been given specifically to the other person. So now both you and your brother have all of God in you, and all of your brothers in you, and all of heaven in you. And it doesn't erase the fact that there are many. It doesn't erase the fact that God has created many children, or that those children create their own creations. Of course, says that this is one continuous line of creation, all on the same level and order. God who encompasses all being, nevertheless created separate beings who have everything individually and want to share it to increase their joy. This is often debated and rejected as some kind of ego statement. No, it's not. It's talking about reality in heaven. God, who encompasses the whole and is the whole, contains containers who contain the whole of him and share the whole together and have everything, the whole, individually. And they want to share it because in order to have it, you have to share it. You can't be possessive of it. And this is natural. This is the state of heaven that even though it doesn't seem to make sense, it is the way things are. And this brings me to what is a separate self? What is the ego, and what is the real meaning of the word separation in terms of the way that heaven is structured and functions versus the way the ego world is structured and functions, and how people are conditioned and they've taught themselves what separation means, and it doesn't quite line up with what Jesus means in the Course, because the way that he's used it is to say that there are separate beings, but they share everything, and one brother is all brothers. There are many brothers who are so similar and so alike, and so having full access to everything that exists, that they are as if they are one. every part is a container of the whole. And so everything the ego perceives is a separate whole without the relationships that imply sharing. And that the absence of those relationships that imply sharing is the only thing that defines what an ego is, in contrast to a soul or a brother, where you've got this whole, the whole of God that everybody is hooked into and sharing access to, and nobody is claiming exclusive rights. No one has special favor. No one has ownership or possession of it. Nobody is allowed to have what others don't have. Nobody can, like, say, this is mine, and I'm going to shut you out and exclude you, so you can't have this. It's only for me. In God's world, that is not possible, and this is what forms the ego. When you, as one of these parts that is a whole, a son of God, one of many sons of God, children of God, direct descendants of God, are attempting, of course, as we asked for special favor, we attempt instead of being a good citizen and sharing everything with everybody else, and everybody literally has the ability to have all of everything, even if others are having it too, without any loss. Somebody comes along and says, I want to have exclusive rights. I want to be selfish. I want to have some of this stuff, but I want to have ownership of it, take possession of it, have it be mine only, at the rejection of everyone else, to exclude them from it, so that I get special stuff, and this special stuff is going to be just mine, and I'm going to put a little fence around it and call it my own, and say, this is my possession, you're not allowed this, you're not included in this, you cannot share this with me, and I'm going to separate this off from the rest of the whole, separate it off from sharing with other brothers, so that you're excluded from it, and all that's left is me, and this little circle of thing that I have taken possession of. And that is what it means to be a separate self, to be the ego. The ego is the idea of selfishness, and the soul is the idea of self-fullness. So when you're in the soul, you're willing to share everything with everyone, and nobody gets exclusive rights. When you're going into ego, you go into selfishness, and you start saying, I want to have some of this for myself, and I don't want you to have it. And that puts a barrier and a separation between you and others, and it stops sharing. You say, I don't want to share. I'm not going to share this with you guys. I want this for myself. I want God to give me special favor and to treat me differently, and so that I am different from you, and I have something that you don't have, that is just for me, just special for me. And that sense of being different or the idea of difference and not sharing, that is what A Course in Miracles means by separation from God. Separation from God, separation in the sonship, separating yourself off from this communal shared experience of wholeness in which everybody gets everything, and going towards selfishness and exclusivity and isolation and ownership and possession, which requires attack, because then you now have to keep people away. It's funny how sometimes when I say something on the camera and I use a word that's very ego, like attack or something like that, sometimes get a little ego attack. It's what you make real, I guess. So the ego uses, the soul uses that attitude of selfishness to attack God and the sonship in order to try to sort of push away everybody else and say, get out of here, this is my stuff, you're not allowed to be here with me, I'm going to be alone, and I want to be isolated, and I want to keep you out, and I'm going to put a fence around myself that you can't get in to the inside of, and I can't get outside of, in order to put up a barrier like a little castle to fence myself in and keep you out, so that I can claim this exclusive ownership and this selfish right to have this special piece of the whole for myself. Everybody else can have the rest if they want, although then you become jealous of them, and this is where the laws of chaos come in with the ego, where you're like, I don't have the whole, and you over there have the rest of it, and I want all of it for myself. So I'm going to steal it from you by attacking you and killing you. So then you can see that if you're keeping everybody else out from sharing you, and you're only wanting to have this little isolated, fenced-in experience that excludes everyone else in order for you to have exclusive ownership of this little piece, this specialness, you then become alone, because now you're inside these boundaries all by yourself. You're not letting God in there. You're not letting the rest of the sonship in there. You're not letting your brothers share this. So now it's just you, all there by yourself inside this prison. And that manifests and materializes as a body. This fence around the mind that is designed to keep you in and hide your specialness and your little treasure trove inside yourself and keep everybody else out. That is the purpose, or was the purpose, of the body. It's a personification of this idea of being a separate self who has stolen away some part of God and put it in a secret box and locked it up in prison and wants to keep it for itself and doesn't want to share it. So in the Course in Miracles, the idea of the separation from God and becoming a separate self does not just hinge around the word separation. And not every instance of the word separation is talking about this dynamic of exclusivity and isolation and specialness and selfishness and being different to others. That is all the ego. So then what will happen is you'll talk about heaven and the nature of heaven and why there are parts, and there are many sons and many children, and you have brothers who are real, and they're part of heaven. They're not an ego idea. They're not part of the separation idea. They're not part of selfishness. Your brothers are your brothers because you are a sibling to them, and both of you are children of God. And that's a real relationship in heaven, in reality, and it's permanent. Your brothers are always going to be your brothers forever and ever. And some people don't believe that. They use the ego to reason this, and they say, well, how can there be many things and it be oneness? How can there be multiple sons or multiple brothers or multiple children and it not be ego separation? Because as soon as you even hint at there being more than one thing, all of a sudden people start thinking, that sounds like duality, and that sounds like the ego, and the ego is the idea of divisions and separations, isn't it? And so you get all this ridiculous wrong conclusions about the sonship, which turns the many sons into there's only one son, and kills off all the souls and destroys God's creation and all the parts of it, because people don't understand how to comprehend the nature of heaven, and they're using the ego to think about a world and a realm where the ego's laws and its ways of thinking and reasoning don't apply, like in all these quotes where it's just completely violated by the sharing that's happening. So like this tree, you'd say it's not that tree. These two trees are separate. If this was heaven, that tree contains that tree, and that tree contains that tree, and there's only one tree, and yet there are two trees. That is heaven's nature. That's not ego. That's not separation. Separation is the attempt to not share with everything else that exists. It's the attempt to not have relationships with others. It is not the fact that there are others. It is only the idea of you trying to not share with them. So you got to think of yourself not as I'm this separate thing, other people are a separate thing in a body. That's what bodies are for, to blind you. But rather think of it as I as a soul exist everywhere. I am as big as the universe. I am in all things, in reality, in God's heaven. There's nowhere that I don't exist. I'm omnipresent, like God. And God has also created additional souls, and each one of those souls is also everywhere and in all things and sharing everything with everyone else. That is natural. That's the natural state of creation. And so the separation idea, or the separation from God, or the ego, is only the idea of going from being everywhere and sharing everything with everyone and trying to narrow yourself down, limit yourself down, compress yourself, withdraw from sharing, and sort of saying, I'm not going to share with everybody anymore. I want to take out my investment and have it for myself. I don't want everybody to have this. And you go into isolation and exclusivity and specialness and imprisonment. And that forms, it condenses down to the form of littleness in a body. And now your body is this idea of this defense, this little fortress that you've built around you, inside it, to keep everybody else out so that you don't share with anyone else. That is the separation. That is the separation idea, this idea of the ego where you say, I don't want everyone else who really does exist to share anything with me. I don't want to have relationships with anyone. I don't want to communicate or commune with anyone. And so it isn't the idea of there's many. That is not the separation idea. The separation idea is not the idea that God created many children or many sons. That is reality. The separate self is only the idea that you don't want to share with the family, and so now you've gone off in a pout in the corner saying, I don't want to be part of this party, I want to have my own little party, and I'm going to reject you and not let you share me, and I'm going to keep myself from you. That is having a separate self. That is what it means to be the ego. And so when you don't have a separate self and you open up and you start sharing and you join with your brothers and you return to heaven and to oneness, you plug yourself back into the whole and back into sharing, you expand way past the body, you become bigger than the universe, you are everywhere and in everything and all people, and now you have returned to the sonship and you've shared all of yourself with everything that exists, and that's the end of exclusivity, it's the end of selfishness, it's the end of being alone, it's the end of separation, it's the end of loss and lack and specialness. And now you're saying, yes, now I'm willing to have it be that everything that I have, you have, and we're going to share God together, and none of us are going to have exclusive rights, and all of us are just going to commune in this shared oneness, and we're all going to be there as individuals, but we're also simultaneously going to have the whole and experience the whole, because we're holographic creations. We're still parts. Every part is a whole within itself and contains the whole. You contain all of God, and so does your brother, and so does your other brother, and so does your other brother. Everyone is a whole. Everyone is a whole. There are many wholes. This is why it defies ego thinking, because that sounds like nonsense. It is nonsense to the ego, because whenever the ego makes sense, it is making nonsense, because the ego is fucking insane. It doesn't make sense. It makes the opposite of sense. It is nonsense, like a sick body is nonsense. A sick body makes no sense, the Course says. So, a separate self does not mean there are many selves. That's not the proper use of the word separation in the Course, and it's not what Jesus means, and it's not the nature of heaven, that as soon as you talk about separation, you're talking about ego. That is bullshit. It is not correct. And what people will do is, with their ego, they'll say, if I get rid of all the separations and take away all the boundaries and all the things that seem to cut things up, and I end up with one thing, this one thing must be the ultimate truth. This is what oneness is like. False. That is the logical conclusion of the ego's thought system. It is not a comprehension of reality. It is not accurately representative of heaven or creation, or the fact that God is a creator and has created many things. And people don't like that, because as soon as you say there's many things, they'll say, well, you're just going backwards and going back into duality, aren't you? No, you're not, because duality is not the same as a reality where there are many wholes that share everything. In duality, there are many wholes that don't share. That is the key difference. Without the relationships that imply sharing, separate objects that don't share, that is duality. Separate things that do share, that is reality. That is God's nature. It is natural. It is okay. It is not the same thing as duality, and God's creation is not non-duality. Non-duality and duality are both bullshit ego concepts. God's creation is holographic omnipresence, and if you can get your head around it and why it makes perfect sense, because it's inclusive logic and not exclusive logic. It's not necessary to have logic where everything is a separate thing and then you reason out the relationships between the things. It's possible to not have separation in the logic and to still be logical. And you can say, if I have this, so do you. That's inclusive logic. Exclusive logic would say, if I have this, you don't have it. So in heaven, God's whole system, his whole thought system, is based on is based on inclusivity, because God's whole reality is inclusive. There's no exclusion in it. And so his thinking follows inclusive reasoning, and he thinks in an inclusive way. He doesn't exclude you when he says, this is mine. That means it's yours too. Or I have the whole. Doesn't mean you don't have the whole either. So in reality, in God's creation, which is not non-duality or duality, there are many wholes, and each one of those wholes shares everything with everything else. And yet there are many. Such is the truth, says Jesus. I'm willing to accept it. It makes sense to me. It makes sense because if you reason it out with inclusive logic, it makes total sense. And all the things that Jesus says in the Course to do with how God thinks and how he shares and the mechanics of heaven and things like that, like to have all, give all to all, and giving is receiving, and when you give, you don't lose, and as you give ideas away, they increase. Those are all inclusive logic and God's laws, the mechanics of God's creation, and it's totally the opposite of this world. Here's a little fact. Reality is permanent. Reality does not change. Reality is always the same. Reality cannot be affected or made to change. Therefore, reality cannot be threatened. Nothing real can be threatened. Anything that changes has been threatened and has been changed, therefore must not be reality. This is impeccable logic. This is so black and white. If it changes, it's not real. If it's the same forever, it is real. I am as God created me. I am the same as I've always been, as God created me. That means that is real. If I'm changing and I have a body that moves and my fingers are changing and my beard's growing and I've got skin that moves around and my eyes open and close, those are all changes. Reality does not change. This must not be real. This is not reality, and God cannot create anything that changes. God is only capable of creating the permanent and that which has eternal life. And eternal life means that it's permanently the same. Everything in this world changes. The planet changes, the solar system changes, the weather changes, the buildings change, the people change, bodies change, plants and animals change. They cannot be real. This is a very, very simple logical argument. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. You could reword that to say, nothing real ever changes. Anything that changes is unreal. Herein lies the peace of God. God is at peace because he knows that nothing has happened. This is the atonement principle. Nothing has changed. Nothing real has changed in reality. Nothing has been affected. Heaven has not been changed at all. You have not been changed. Your soul has not been affected by separation ideas. That stuff's real. Anything that changes and shifts and transforms and grows and dies cannot be reality. Therefore, this world, earth, cannot have been created by God. It is not like God. It is not God's nature. It does not reflect his will. It doesn't function the way that heaven functions. The objects and their relationships and their lack of sharing is completely opposite to what happens in heaven. This world is not even in any way, shape, or form like God or the kind of world that God would create. And it comes down to that simple logic that anything that changes is not real. Therefore, planet Earth is not real and God did not create it. God did not create human bodies. And that is very, very simple and clear, but some people, many people, unfortunately, don't like that. Not willing to accept that. Want to keep believing that God created this world and that it's special. If you can recognize why this world is not like heaven at all, and its laws are not the same, and this world is filled with fundamental sacrifice and loss and lack and limitation, even in the laws that govern it and the things that run it and that make space-time be what it is, completely opposite to what God would intend and create. And that is why God did not create this world. This earth, planet Earth, physical reality Earth, is not reality. It is not God's creation. Unfortunately, in heaven, we have a very different experience whereby I get to have access to the whole and enjoy the entire thing as all mine. And you get to have the whole too and have the entire thing as yours. And I get to share you and you get to share me and we get to share with Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God. And there's just one great big sharing and a complete lack of selfishness. And all of us get to celebrate together as equals and as children of God. That is the wonder of heaven. Heaven is a holographic creation of God in which every part gets to share the whole. So you've got to learn to think very differently. You've got to learn to think like God means you've got to learn to think without using exclusions, without using separations, without saying, if I've got this, you don't have it. Or if this is true, that's false. It's a very different world. It's a very different reality. It's a very different system that runs on very different logical rules. and it doesn't proceed the way this world proceeds, or the way the ego proceeds, or how the ego thinks. So you cannot think about it with that kind of ego world thinking. You just will come to so many wrong conclusions and assumptions, and you'll think that there's only one sun, because how can there be two suns that share everything and be one? And then oneness becomes this idea of everybody just melting into a blob. That also is not true. You can have oneness at the same time as manyness. Yes, makes no sense to the ego, but the ego is insane. So God has children. God has created us as brothers, as equals, loves us equally. You cannot enter into relationship with any of God's children unless you're willing to love them all and equally. Kingdom of God contains all his children and their creations. This defies ego thinking, and you got to be very, very careful when you're thinking about heaven and God and his reality and the sonship and the Holy Spirit and Jesus, souls, individual beings. You got to be very careful. If you're thinking in an ego way, you will conclude very strange things, like that the sonship is an illusion, or God only has one son. See, God directly created many children, and yet because those many children share everything, the sharing of everything is the Christ mind. It is the one Son. There is this one Son, this one shared mind, but there are many beings sharing that mind. There are many souls sharing that mind. There is one Son and many sons. In God's logic, there is always A and B. There's no exclusion. I get stuff and you get stuff. There's no selfishness. In the ego's world, it's A or B. You can have this, but you can't have that. You got to exclude it. You got to lack it. You got to sacrifice. These are different ways of thinking and existing and reasoning, and different worlds, different thought systems, different ways of thinking. So you gotta be careful which way you're using, because if you think about anything to do with heaven, God's creation, if you use ego reasoning, you're gonna mangle the crap out of it and conclude things that are not true, that seem to make sense. So learn to think differently, think inclusively, and we both do, and increases, and there's no loss, and we share. That's the kind of thinking that you got to have to be part of the Holy Spirit's thought system, and to be the way God created you. So I don't know if this has been helpful or what. I'm just kind of rambling on, but take it or leave it, whatever. Love, light, and be as God created you, as you've always been, the same as me, the same as everyone. We are not bodies. Bodies are ego fiction. They don't exist. There is no world. Only heaven. Heaven remains the one alternative to the strange world that you made, with all of its shifting and its tragic joys and sorrows. Earth is opposite to heaven in every way. Every way. This is not like heaven at all. So remember your home, and know that there's a very different world waiting for you, and it's way better than this shithole. Love it as much as you like, but it's not real. It's just a dream, and God loves you. Bye.